Got it. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is the first guest that we're hosting at the Salem Center this fall, starting our studio program that's going to have lots and lots of people coming through, and hopefully some exciting topics on ranging from today, cultural socialism, all the way to, what is this god over here? All the way in this one? Yeah. It's not here. It's on the second screen. Oh. I'll click that. Not on the second screen. Oh, got it. Yeah, okay. Anyway, going back here, pleasure to have Eric with us today. And Eric Kaufmann from the University of London. Eric has been a leading voice on academic freedom issues in the UK, not only from thinking through what are the solutions to this problem might be, but also quantifying, putting a lot of data behind the issues that universities in the UK, and by association, I think a lot of data that you have collected are also in the US. So that's a big topic of interest of ours, understanding the role of academic freedom and how has that been in jeopardy in our institutions. So Eric, pleasure to have you here. Take it away.
Thanks, Carlos. Thanks a lot. Great to be here. And I have got a number of slides on the data, and I can go into a lot of detail. I've basically selected only a very small number of the things that I've done. But what I really want to talk about is this broader question, this broader ideological conflict, which I think has been developing between something I call cultural socialism, which I think is actually the most appropriate term for it, and on the other hand, cultural liberalism. So I'm going to look at this through the prism. I'm going to talk a little bit about institutions, a bit about public opinion, and then I also want to look at solutions policy-wise, what can be done to arrest what seems to be an inevitable tide. So first off, I'm working with this distinction between what I call cultural liberalism, which is more of a classical liberal approach, free speech, due process, equal treatment without regard to race, for example, gender, creed, scientific reason, and the idea of objective truth and scientific methods. So Jonathan Rauch in his book, Constitution of Knowledge, talks a lot about this sort of truth-based order in the defense of these classical liberal values. Against that, we have what I'm calling cultural socialism, which is, I think, got a lot of echoes of economic socialism, but of course it's got some differences as well. But the general theme and the general thrust in cultural socialism is egalitarian, except instead of necessarily redistributing wealth between class groups or rich and poor, this is about redistributing what are often cultural goods like self-esteem or power perhaps between identity groups. Okay, so it's really about taking from what are seen to be the oppressor or historically advantaged groups and redistributing to the historically disadvantaged groups. The other part of this is a kind of protection from harm of these historically disadvantaged groups. And that's not just physical harm, but it's emotional and psychological harm or trauma, protecting minorities from psychological trauma and redistributing what are seen as structural inequalities of self-esteem, power, resources. So that's the key then to understanding cultural socialism. It's cultural for a whole bunch of reasons. First of all, the groups are based on identity, not class. Secondly, there's a lot of emphasis placed on cultural narratives, symbols, names of things, words that you use. All of these sorts of cultural aspects are seen to be creating the kind of invisible matrix which reproduces these structures of oppression. So very much a cultural form of socialism. So it's kind of a bit like a new Cold War. Instead of economic liberalism and economic socialism, we've got cultural liberalism and cultural socialism. The cultural socialism is very strong, obviously, in traditionally left-wing environments, and it is also growing substantially amongst the younger generation, even when you control for ideology. A young far leftist is much less tolerant than an old far leftist. A young centrist is much more illiberal than an older centrist. So we've got a generational issue coming up, which is going to mean, I think, that these ideas are going to only increase in their institutional power and not decrease. Just because we've got Harper's and the New York Times and the Atlantic writing op-eds, that's not going to make much difference. This is not a blip. My view is it's sort of baked into the generational cake. I'm going to see an increasing challenge really to the cultural liberal paradigm.
Yeah. I absolutely hate, and what I mean my personal opinion, but I think that hopefully you have some data on this. This sort of false equivalent, when you say that a young liberal now, is much more liberal, much more leftist than when I say liberal, I mean American liberal, sorry.
Okay,
leftist.
You can't use that term.
Sorry. A young leftist is way more intolerant and illiberal relative to an old one. Does that apply to a young right-leaning person?
The differences are much less for the right. There's less difference because they're somewhat more mobilized against this. So the differences would be least amongst the right-leaners, but there would still be some. It's not zero. They are still somewhat more likely not to want someone to come on campus and say BLM is a hate group, for example, or say abortion should be completely illegal. So I mean, these are just questions that FIRE has asked in its campus expression surveys. So, yeah.
So, again, the cultural socialism, the distribution of power and resources, is it fair to say that they're much more okay with inequality, even amongst those things, as long as the groups have, like, the old socialism, you're supposed to squish everyone. Here, it's okay to have people with a lot of power as long as there's representation of the marginalized groups. Is that fair?
Yeah.
This seems to be a feature, but it's perfectly fine when you're important faculty members as long as we have the right things.
Yeah, as long as the racial, as long as there isn't a race gap or gender gap within a race, you can have huge class inequality. That doesn't matter very much. It's mainly about what are the top line numbers for income or wealth or power or whatever it is between racial groups. And even within racial groups, there's not, no one's going to care if, Jews are doing a lot better than Gypsy and Irish travelers, or whether, Nigerians are doing better than Somalis. That none of that really matters. The only categories that matter are these kind of racial, gender, depending on the issue, sometimes sexual orientation. Now, of course, there are things like fatness, but I think these other kinds of categories have a very low salience. They don't matter very much. Disability, etc. They don't matter much. It's mainly around race, gender, to some degree sexuality, depending on the issue. So, yeah.
Sorry.
And please ask questions, please. Yeah.
Do you think that has more to do with the function of that they're the easiest identifiable features as far as like being the demographics that people are being grouped into for?
Obviously they're very identifiable. Yeah, you need something that's identifiable to build an identity around. It's harder to build an identity around sort of being low IQ. Even though that's probably a much bigger determinant of privilege, to actually get groups to recognize each other and to mobilize and have a narrative of identity around being low IQ or being unattractive, harder, right? Whereas, but if you, however, the one thing I would say is, there have been other sort of categories that have mattered more. So, like in this country, if we went back before 1965, Protestant Catholic Jew was a big issue, and similarly in Britain and Canada. So the emphasis would have been on, are you a WASP or are you a Catholic mattered a lot. And the racial thing was there, but it wasn't politicized or didn't matter as much politically, arguably, as whether you were a Catholic and you're voting for John F. Kennedy or you're Protestant. So that's kind of, these things can switch around. So I do think there's also a degree in which history and ideology will make certain categories more salient in certain periods. And right now, I think race, gender, sexual orientation are kind of the holy trinity, really, and have been kind of sacralized by the left as part of its, that's really what it cares about. It doesn't care as much about proletariat. So there's been a shift in categories. So the other thing I kind of want to talk about here is, so this is a British police car with the pride coloring. And you have these institutions like the military, the police, defense contractors, who are doing all these woke things. And you know, it's not as though their employees are majority woke, right? It's kind of, as university, you might understand it, but how's this happening to the police and the military? And I think that sort of brings up, you know, one of the points I make is that we need to talk not just about those intersectional woke activists. We have to also talk about public morality. So it's like saying we can't just talk about religious fundamentalism without talking about religion, right? So it's the religion, if it's taken for granted that everybody's Muslim, for example, then if the Taliban or you know, Muslim Brotherhood come up with a very austere kind of fundamentalist message, say, you know, gender segregation has to be absolute because it says so in the Quran, it's really hard to answer back when everybody is more or less a Muslim and a believer. And similarly, I think we've got to ask questions about what is this sort of tissue of public morality post-civil rights in the West. And that sort of tissue of public morality is very conducive to the kind of activism we're seeing now, because the things that it holds most dear are sort of well, equality and protection from harm for identity groups. That is the sort of really where public morality is in a lot of Western countries. The highest, the thing that you're going to get in the greatest amount of trouble for is violating these taboos. And so that's not really a bunch of intersectional activists that are driving this. It is, they are keying into the fact that these are the sort of highest public morals, and so they know they've got a lot of moral authority when they key into those values. And somebody who's written quite intelligently about this is Shelby Steele, the Hoover Institute, and he's got a book called White Guilt, and you may or may not be familiar with this argument that what he says is that after the civil rights movement, white Americans and the American state more or less admitted that it did wrong. And so when it did that, it actually lost its moral authority. The entire national narrative, the Constitution, everything from 1776 was essentially lost its moral authority. And the sort of, in fact, it used to be the case that whites possessed moral authority for being whites, which allowed them to get away with all kinds of things with regard to minority groups. However, after the civil rights movement, the valence for the sign switches, and all of a sudden it's whites who now must actively disassociate themselves from racism in order to retain moral authority. And institutions must do the same. So for Steele, what they're doing is they are virtue signaling by things they say and the policies they adopt so that they can show that they still have moral authority. So for example, an affirmative action policy is not meant to actually fix a problem. It is meant to sort of virtue signal that this institution isn't racist. Our university or federal government, we're not racist because, hey, look what we're doing. We've got affirmative action going on. So it's not about fixing a problem. It's about virtue signaling. Now, what happens is this is a very effective model. And as Steele says, quote, you know, the idea is we whites are the contrite people and we defer to other races. This is our identity, he writes. So once you have the fall, you have a big change in public morality. All of a sudden, anti-racism becomes the highest element in public morality. And then other groups sort of see this tremendous moral power that's contained in this kind of identity politics model. And you see Quebec nationalists claiming to be the African Americans of Canada. You see, you know, the Northern Irish Catholics calling their movement the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Movement. You see also these new social movements of, for example, you know, radical feminism, gay and lesbian movements. You see Chicano, other ethnic movements that are borrowing this template that is developed from the civil rights movement onward. Yeah.
Why is this happening now? Because I would have thought that, you know, if people in their 40s sort of don't remember the pre-civil rights era, we certainly don't feel responsible for the pre-civil rights era. So why would we see, you know, you told me this was happening in 1985. People in the 1940s, you know, could legitimately be blamed for the policies of 1955. But, you know, now all those people are either retired or passed on. Why is this happening now when, if you look at, you know, the vast majority of the white, you know, white people in America, they weren't even alive or certainly didn't have any decision-making power pre-1965 or even pre-1985.
Yes, so that's a good question. I mean, and by the way, you could ask a similar question about why 1965? Like, why not when women got the vote? Why weren't men suddenly sort of on their knees in front of women? Or why, after the slavery was abolished, why didn't we have white guilt after slavery? You know, so I think the other part that Steele is missing is the left actually was very keen on this. The American left, as it switches from class to identity, it was extremely excited. I'll talk about that in a minute. Eagerly leapt into this. They wanted this white guilt. So it's not just the case that, oh, okay, we did wrong and it's a bad thing that whites suddenly felt that they had to sort of bow that. No, actually, I think there was a significant group on the left that was looking for something like this. And so they then adopt the position of black radicalism in the 1960s. They say, yeah, no, this is where the excitement is, this is where the energy is. And the left had been kind of moribund. They lost faith in the working class to make revolution. So they're switching over to identity categories. And now, just to say that this was very much of a tipping point when suddenly anti-racism becomes public morality. And this is Paul Krugman in 2013 talking about his own recollection of how fast suddenly these taboos came in, and suddenly he's talking about people repainting their statues of black coachmen on their split level ranch homes all of a sudden, just one summer. And so I just did a little small survey of people over 75 in the US and Britain, asking them when these taboos came in, when they can recall these taboos against racism coming in. And you can kind of see a spread in the US sort of between 1954 and 1966, sort of the modal response is about 57. There was already, to some degree, racism was becoming less acceptable already in the early 50s. And you were getting this slow burn, and then suddenly you had the civil rights movement, and then suddenly it was a taboo. The UK, it happened later. Actually, in the UK, you had phenomena even in the early 1980s of soccer fans throwing bananas at black players. I mean, that was actually happening in the early 80s, right? So this, in the UK, it doesn't happen really until a later period that this racism taboo comes in. But in different societies and different times, it comes in and it's completely upends the public morality. And it's that context we have to understand in order to understand why the soil is so fertile for someone coming along and accusing you of being a racist. That's gonna really sting because this public morality is in place. Once that public morality is in place, it really offers a lot of opportunity for outrage entrepreneurs. Now, why did it take as long as it did? What I would say is, actually, there have been cancel culture events that started happening in the late 60s. They just happened at a lower frequency, but they existed. An example from the 70s was James Coleman, who was a famous sociologist who had been pro-busing, and then he turned against busing and said, well, actually, this is leading to white flight. It's having negative effects for everybody. It's just not a good policy. But that was then, he was giving this talk on the Eastern Sociological Association, and there are people on stage waving placards saying racist, Nazi, all this sort of stuff. That was already happening in the mid-70s, or E.O. Wilson on sociobiology and this idea of evolution, that biology really is very important to explain social behavior, called a eugenicist a Nazi. That was mid-70s, so it's already happening much earlier. And there are other incidents. I mean, there was an incident, and this is just one of a number of incidents in the mid-1990s. I'm from Vancouver, Canada. In the University of British Columbia, political science department was completely paralyzed in the mid-1990s by these random accusations of racism and sexism, not about any one professor or any one person who was experiencing this, but there's just this culture of racism and sexism. They had this consultant come in for like $250,000, write this damning report, but there was like no smoking gun and nobody did anything. And eventually it just became a laughingstock. But that's just to say that these are not brand new phenomena of the last 10 years. They have been going on, but there were just fewer foot soldiers. We didn't have social media, harder to organize a flash mob. So what you've got is this sort of, and I'll show it in a minute, a kind of building up of cultural power. So there's kind of three things that happen with this change in public morality. One is the radicals. The radical left really switches from class and the old Marxist stuff to identity, to cultural socialism. Here's a quote from Susan Sontag. Some of you may or may not know. Susan Sontag was a member of the New York Intellectuals, which is kind of the established left-wing group, or one of the leading lights of the left in America in the period 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So Sontag was sort of one of the younger generation of the New York Intellectuals, had written absolutely nothing about race at all prior to this. And then suddenly we get 1966, she's asked to write about, you know, these new exciting things that are going on with black radicalism and post-civil rights. And she writes something like this, and this is a sort of white American, you know, America was founded on genocide, the most brutal system of slavery in modern times. The white race is the cancer of human history. It is the white race, it alone, eradicates civilizations wherever it spreads. This is a passionately racist country and will continue to be so in the foreseeable future. So you have this statement, which is, you know, you could transpose that to today and you wouldn't notice any difference. I mean, it's Sarah Jung at the New York Times, this sort of thing. That's pretty standard kind of critical race theory, not critical race theory, but that kind of scholar is most likely to say something like this. But it was already being said in 1966. But this was brand new. As the morality shifts, the radicalism shifts from the economy to identity categories. But also what happens is this sort of tissue of public morality changes. People are sincerely believing that the highest morality, the key to morality in a way, is being anti-racist. So that is something people sincerely believe, at least in polite society, at least at the sort of high cultural level. And then you also get a shift in the nature of taboos. It's not so much about being un-American and being a communist or being, you know, these other things which had defined morality in the 50s, for example, lose a lot of their force, and suddenly it is really about not being seen as racist, as we saw in the Krugman quote, that the nature of public taboos really shifts. And now here's kind of the institutionalization process. You may or may not be able to see these charts. These are from Google Ngram, which looks at all English language books published in American English. It's 1960 to 2019, and we have two words here. The first is racism, and the second is sexist. The pattern in the amount, in the frequency of use of these terms is very similar. There are three, what we might call great awakenings. So we've got the late 1960s, a big increase. We have the sort of politically correct era, late 80s, early 90s, another increase. And then we have what Matthew Iglesias calls the Great Awakening, which is kind of the 2010s onward era as well. We have these three periods, and for those of you who know the history of American Protestantism, there have also been kind of three major Great Awakenings. Two major ones, but also the Pentecostal awakening. So we've got these three kind of almost religious revivals. But the problem is, well, each time you get an awakening, the interest in these topics, it plateaus, they kind of consolidate. It's not as though this is a blip, or the political correctness debate in the 1990s was a blip and then it fades away. No, it actually consolidates and then maybe goes down a little bit, but then we're back up again at a higher level. So there is this consolidation and institutionalization process. I'll show you it from another paper by David Rosato. What happens is this happens first in academia, and then in this last Great Awakening, it's really spread into the media. So what Rosato does is he's got 175 million scholarly abstracts since 1970, and he's also looking at 25 million news articles from the mainstream press. And in almost every case, this solid line, which is the academic abstracts, this is racism, racist, xenophobia, white supremacy. So those topics are appearing more in academic abstracts from 1970 through to about 2015 and thereabouts, and then this dotted line, which is the media, suddenly converges in this sort of post-2013-14 period. Same thing on sexism, sexist, misogyny, patriarchy, gender discrimination. A lot more attention to these terms in academia, but then the media really catches up in the sort of post-2013-14. Same for homophobia, etc. So what's happening is these ideas are sort of starting out in academia, and then they are being picked up now by the media, something which hadn't occurred in the past. The media was actually not as involved in these sorts of things, in this cultural socialism, but it's now really bought into it in a big way. Here's a plot looking at the New York Times, one particular outlet, and the frequency of use of these two terms. And just to show you the magnitude of that explosion, really, post about 20, this is pre-Trump actually, already by 2015, it had already risen and was showing, and Zach Goldberg's done an analysis of this. Now, of course, as this happens in the media, it then starts to affect public opinion amongst those, particularly amongst white liberals or whites who identify as left or center. They become much more likely to say that there's racism, white supremacy, and so on, as a result of this increasing media attention post-2014, thereabouts. This is a chart that just really tries to summarize three sets of terms, one which we'll call prejudice terms like racist, sexist, homophobia, Islamophobia. That's the blue line. The social justice terms, which is diversity, equality, inclusive, discrimination, slavery, colonialism, cultural appropriation, those sorts of things. And then in red, we have the backlash terms, wokeness, woke mob, illiberal left, social justice warrior, and so on. And the trend in the media is you first get the rise of the social justice, sort of more cultural socialist terms, starting around sort of early 2010s. By about 2016, 17, that's when you start to see the backlash occurring. And these are all going upwards and upwards. The same trend in Britain as in the United States, as in other Western countries. The Anglo countries have it more extreme, but we're seeing the same trend of increasing media coverage of culture war terms. It's almost like they're riffing off each other now. So yeah, this is the sort of very real absorption. Yeah, go ahead.
So let's talk a little more about the Anglo country thing. In my mind, sort of the Britain and her colonies have always been kind of ground zero for a lot of this stuff and backlash. Is that my imagination?
Yeah, they are ground zero, but they often are a little bit, they're lagging a little bit, the trends in the US. So the US trends tend to influence very quickly Canada and Britain, who consume a lot of US news and whose newspapers will tend to, they'll tend to report a lot of things that happen in the US. But in terms of the
language thing?
What's that?
Does it travel better in English?
It travels better in English, yeah, because if you're not an English-speaking society, yes, a lot of those places do speak English, but the attention is not as strong. Now, I will say that even in the non-English-speaking Western countries, these trends are occurring. It's just that the magnitude of the coverage is not as strong. I mean, the number of articles talking about these things in Britain and the US is just enormous now. I mean, I'm trying to think what this is. It's as a frequency, I mean, it's in the thousands and thousands of articles. So it's a very noticeable increase. Okay, so this is sort of the context of the rise and penetration of cultural socialist ideas outside of the academy, into the media, into the broader part of society, and they're starting to affect institutions as well. So I want to now just move to talk a little bit about organizations and some of the dynamics in organizations, because I think there's a mistake if we think that it's about fear. If we think that it's preference falsification, and that really that everybody is more or less sane, but they're just scared to speak up and put their head above the parapet. I think that is not a correct interpretation of what is occurring in elite organizations, certainly not in the cultural organizations like universities and media. So if you just recall the kind of three dynamics I talked about, one was this idea of the radicals, the radical left switching from class to identity very quickly, adopting the rhetoric of black radicals. So what Susan Sontag was saying, I mean, black radicals had been talking about white people as white devils and all these sorts of things, but just in those black radical circles, that leaks out then, and the white left appropriates that and adopts it as part of its identity. So you have the radicals, but then you also have this public morality and private morality, which shifts so that anti-racism becomes kind of the highest, most cardinal virtue of private and public morality. And so that really changes the landscape on which activists can operate, they're now operating on very favorable terrain. The incentive structure is there for outrage entrepreneurs to emerge, and they do emerge a little bit already in the 60s and 70s, but that just ramps up as they enter organizations such as universities, become professors, become administrators, have students who, Angela Davis, for example, the Black Panther, she will influence people who will then have their own students who will spread. So we get a spreading of this. It's a bit like a mind virus. I mean, you had Gad Saad here, but I put a lot of faith in this kind of, almost like a COVID cultural model, bottom up. The culture is spreading to new minds who then spread it to other minds. That emergence is the way I would tend to see this. I don't tend to see this as rational self-interest of particular actors. Now, rational self-interest does matter. So these entrepreneurs are gaining a certain amount of power and prestige. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there any evidence that sort of on the personal morality side that sort of in households there's kind of backstage, like front stage and backstage kind of behavior at home? Like somebody needs your mind. Or is it kind of like, husbands and wives seem to be on the same page, correcting each other?
Well, I mean, there is survey data on asking people if they self-censor in different places, like at work, at the bar, So work is where they self-censor the most. They would self-censor less at home. So there is less self-censorship. But I'm not saying there's no fear. All I'm saying is that the fear factor is less important than the true belief. So I want to make the argument that I think these people genuinely believe that they are being morally bad, and there's a lot of support for what I would call cultural socialism, as I'll show in a minute. Even on a survey where you're just taking this on a computer, there's no one looking at you. There's no one going to cancel you. What we'll see is there's a lot of support for these policies. So this is an example of what I mean. The question reads, I know it's obscured. Please imagine you are in the following situation at work. There's a proposal at a staff meeting of 20 people to require all current and future employees as a condition of employment to sign a pledge to, quote, increase diversity and achieve equal outcomes between groups, and to confront or to combat structures of white supremacy and patriarchy operating within the organization. Those who refuse to sign must leave the company. Okay, so we have this scenario which is laid out. This is UK data. I've run this in the US as well. It's relatively similar. What you tend to get is a split. You actually tend to, and now in this case, there were more people who supported this policy. In blue, that's like 56%. If you add all of this up, and this is only 44%. Now, some other surveys, it might go the other way a little bit. But the bottom line is you've actually got a significant number of people who support this. In a survey, this is not about sticking your head above the parapet. Now, I did ask, okay, so let's say you oppose it. Would you raise your hand and express opposition in the meeting? Would you not be willing to raise your hand, but you might raise your hand if everyone else did, or if a bunch of people raised their hand. Or you wouldn't be willing to raise your hand, but you would sort of vote against it in a secret ballot. Now, it is true that you're getting a significant number of people who would only raise their hand if others raise their hand, or they would only vote against this in a secret ballot. And that's slightly larger than the number of people who say they would openly raise their hand. So there is an element to which people are shy, but then we see that also amongst the people who are in favor of this policy. A significant number of those people wouldn't raise their hand alone either. So it's not clear that there is necessarily a reluctance, especially amongst those who oppose something like a mandatory diversity statement, to raise their hand. Now, it is true that amongst these people who oppose the policy and said they wouldn't raise their hand alone, something like 80% of them did agree that not wanting to be seen as a racist would be a motivation for them not raising their hand alone. So it is a factor, but I think the dominant picture here is really that there's just a lot of people who look at this as saying, yeah, that sort of sounds pretty good, increase diversity, achieve equal outcomes, yeah, we're going to sign up to this. They really believe that this is actually the moral thing to do, and they support it. And I think we underestimate how many people are kind of I would say seduced by the kind of velvet glove of cultural socialism that surrounds the iron fist, right? So if you refuse, you got to leave the company. It's pretty authoritarian, but doesn't seem to matter in this phrasing. The other thing, of course, is that it's not the case that people are either 100% cultural socialist, 100% cultural liberal. So on these surveys, for example, if we say, has political correctness gone too far? Agree or disagree? You'll get 80% of Americans and 80% of Brits agreeing political correctness has gone too far. But then if you say, well, hate speech is a big problem in society, you'll also get 80%. So I think the only effective way to do this kind of research is to force people to choose. Okay, and here's a question that YouGov has run for quite a long time, and which I'm just using here on a US sample. Are you for political correctness because it protects against discrimination, or are you against it? It stifles freedom of speech. And that kind of makes people choose, in a way, which they value more. A somewhat of a cultural socialist value of, yeah, let's be politically correct, let's not express ourselves and in order to protect minorities, or are you opposed to this because it's stifling freedom of speech? And by party identification, you can see there's a big divide. Strong Democrats, 65% pro-political correctness, strong Republicans, 65% against. Now, if we take a left-wing group, such as social sciences and humanities academics, we see an even stronger support for political correctness on that question. So in the UK, on a YouGov sample, it was 76% of social science humanities academics in favor of political correctness and only 20% opposed. And I think that gives us a good sense of which values are dominating amongst academics in the social sciences and humanities, who lean left by about, it's about 75%, 70 to 75% left, and about 5%, perhaps in the UK, 5 to 10% on the right. So that is sort of where academia in the social sciences and humanities is. And so it's not surprising then that they're going to be heavily in favor of political correctness. 76%, only 20 against. However, the answers, the balance between cultural socialism and cultural liberalism does shift as we ask different questions. So, do you support diversity statements as a requirement for a job? There's a sample from the US, UK, Australia, Canada, top universities, social sciences. We got 57% support for diversity statements and only 27% of opposition. Again, I think showing us this is not about an academy that hates diversity statements. They're supporting diversity statements. They truly believe that this is a moral and good thing to do. How about race and gender quotas on reading lists? You got to have at least 20% non-white, at least 30% female on your reading list. 44% US, UK, Canada sample of academics are supportive and only 32% against. So still what we're seeing is the cultural socialist position is stronger than the cultural liberal position. Now, it starts to change as we move towards the next set of questions. So quotas for groups or foundational texts as the basis for your reading list. Now all of a sudden it's much more even. 47% favoring foundational texts, 39% favoring race and gender quotas. Social justice or academic freedom, which is the more important value? 56% for academic freedom, only 27% social justice. Do you support or oppose firing controversial academics? US, UK, Canada sample. Only 10% support firing controversial academics in a set of 5 hypothetical scenarios. Research that touches on race, gender, and reports politically incorrect findings. Only 10% of academics support canceling those controversial academics, whereas 50% oppose that. And then finally, should reading lists represent social groups, or should the academic control the reading lists? It's like 80% in favor of academic control. Now, what I would say is those last 4 questions, particularly the last 3, we're starting to see the cultural liberal position winning out because they directly implicate individual academics. So your right to set your own reading list, the chance of you being fired, you not having control over your reading list. So it's much more personal. It's much more about your own freedom. And I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing a shift towards recognizing, actually, I think I'm going to favor the cultural liberal position. However, when it's just a general principle and you don't think you're going to be harmed by it, more academics are actually backing these sorts of cultural socialist positions on political correctness, diversity statements, and so forth. And they really do differ from the public. So in Britain, the public is 47% against political correctness versus 37% for, whereas academics are the reverse, 76-20. So academics are way more cultural socialists than the general public are. Okay. Well, what I've been talking about is this idea of being canceled, fired for having a controversial view, or being told you've got to change your reading list, institutional power being applied, curtailing the academic freedom to set your own reading list, for example, or do controversial research. But it's not just institutional punishment that is at the core of the illiberalism in this new order. It is also, I would argue, a more important factor is peer-to-peer political discrimination. Political prejudice is incredibly important, I think, to explain the self-censorship and chilling effects that underpin the new moral order. And I'm just going to sort of bring in quite a bit of data here, partially from Noah Carl's blog post on Who Doesn't Want to Hear the Other Side's View, which has just been updated in December of 2021. He's just bringing together a bunch of different survey research that shows essentially a very strong asymmetry. So we've got an asymmetry in the sense that the right is less prejudiced against the left, and the left is prejudiced against the right, at least in elite settings, in college settings. So here's something from Pew 2012. Have you ever blocked, unfriended, or hidden someone on a social networking site because they posted something you disagreed with? 16% of liberals, meaning leftists in the American terminology, 16% on the left are saying that they blocked, unfriended, or hid somebody because they posted something they disagreed with, compared to only 8% of conservatives. Argued about political issues, 11% of those on the left blocked somebody versus 7% on the right. Here's another example from 2017. Cato did a survey. Do you agree with the following statement? It's hard to be friends with people who voted for Donald Trump. Now, I know Trump is extreme, etc., but it is interesting. We'll see that it's not just in Britain. It's not just in the U.S. We see this phenomenon in Britain as well. So 61% of Clinton voters said it would be very hard to be friends with someone who voted for Donald Trump, whereas only 34% of Trump voters said it would be hard to be friends with someone who voted for Clinton. So that's an example of this, what looks like an almost 2-to-1 asymmetry in terms of political bias. Okay, here is something which is for the US, UK, Canada, Australia. Yeah, go ahead.
You said you see this in Britain.
Yeah.
You see it about Clinton and Trump.
No, not Clinton and Trump. It'd be Brexit Remain in Britain. Will be. I'll show you that in a minute. But this is from a survey that Matt Goodwin, who's sort of a colleague of mine in Britain.
Eric, in fairness, no Yankees fans don't like to hang out with their country.
Right. Yeah, I guess the question is how strong is the intensity? Would you not want your daughter to marry? Right. I don't know which team you support, but I just think it would be a much more playful thing rather than, I wouldn't want them to marry. I wouldn't want to befriend. I wouldn't want to live next door to. I think this is just much stronger, but more importantly than the strength of it, it's the asymmetry. Why is it that the left is more allergic to the right than the right is to the left? So it's the asymmetry that I'm trying to focus on. Yeah, do you want to come in or?
Well, one, I just wanted to say, make the observation that if you're referring to these sorts of political affiliations in the same way that people view their affiliation with teams, and sports teams, that might be a deeper insight into political views and political formation than you may not want to gloss over that too quickly. And also, as the only probably the only Yankee fan in the room, I don't really care about the Sox fans as long as they keep it about 5 to send feedback away from me.
Okay, good point. Anyway, yeah, and this survey, what we've got is data from 4 countries. So this is moving away from the US. It's only a quarter of the sample is the US. So UK, Canada, Australia, and it's asking academics from top universities, mainly social sciences, in fact, almost entirely, how they feel about different groups of voters in society. So 70% of self-identified left-wing academics, which is the overwhelming majority of the sample, rate right-wing voters below a 5. That is, they're relatively cool towards right-wing voters. But only 36% of the right-wing academics in this sample are rating left-wing voters below a 5. So again, another, I think, example of this asymmetry that we're seeing, where the political bias is just much stronger on the left. And we can look at other data from the UK. Those who voted to leave the European Union or voted for the Conservative Party are much less, and again, it's about a 2-to-1 ratio, less likely to say, I wouldn't date somebody with the opposing political view than someone who voted for Britain to remain in the EU or voted for the Labour Party. Here's another example from the US. American college students, Democrat students, 71% wouldn't go on a date with a Republican. 31% of Republicans wouldn't go on a date with a Democrat. We take shop at or support a business. 41% of Democrat students wouldn't shop at or support a business run by a Republican. Only 7% of Republicans vis-a-vis Democrats. And so we see this kind of significant asymmetry here. Time and time again in the data.
Yeah. There's a problem. There's generally a problem here,
yeah.
Which is, let's be honest, men are conservative, women are very liberal. That's a big split. There's a group. So that'll be a problem of matching now.
Right.
It's a huge problem of matching, right? So the men are saying, sure, I'll go out with that, you know. But the person knows, so the guys are lying. They don't say that, not openly.
Yeah, I'm sure that, obviously it's just very abstract, right, and very hypothetical.
Right, exactly.
But,
so there's some truth to it. There's a, you know,
well, it's interesting, the gender thing, okay? So if we look here, and this is kind of from the FIRE study, which is just a massive survey. 2 waves, it's now 55,000 US undergrads, roughly the top 150 colleges. You know, of course, men are more willing to go on a date with somebody else from the other party, absolutely. They're less choosy, we know that, right? But even so, what is remarkable is only 19% of Democrat male students say they would date a Trump supporter. It's only 7% amongst Democrat female students, okay. But even for male, it's pretty low, whereas if we kind of look at people who are opponents of Trump, 66% of Republican men would date a Trump opponent, 51% of Republican women would date a Trump opponent. It's a very, very different story from these numbers. So again, it's this kind of interesting asymmetry. Now, why am I focusing on this dating question? Okay, people can date who they like, whatever. The issue is, however, that there's a correlation between willingness to date and willingness to hire. So young people, for example, who are not willing to date a Remain supporter of Britain are significantly more likely to not hire. Not willing to date a Leave supporter are significantly more likely to discriminate against them in hiring. So we've got a kind of problem of political prejudice, which is much stronger, I would argue, at least in elite cultural institutions, much stronger against those on the right. And what does that mean in institutions that are left-dominated, like universities? I've done a number of studies, as you may know, on faculty opinion. And I used a list experiment in the US, Canada, and the UK just to ask about, would you hire a known Trump supporter for a job, an academic post? And the list experiment sort of reveals that 40% of a US academics poll would not hire a known Trump supporter for a job. In Canada, 45% wouldn't hire a known Trump supporter. And even 22% openly admit that in a survey. This is without the list experiment, 27 in Canada. In the UK, 32% were revealed not to be willing to hire a non-Brexit supporter. This is massive levels of discrimination, actually. So, of course, if you are a Brexit supporter in Britain, you're not going to let that slip to your colleagues if you want to be promoted, or if you want, or if you want to get a job. If you're a graduate student, you're going to keep that under wraps. I think the survey data showed only about 2 in 10 UK academics, only about 20% said that a Brexit supporter would be willing to express that view, and in the US it was like 10% of people said that a Trump supporter would be willing to share that with a colleague. So yeah, we have this powerful political discrimination contributing massively to chilling effects and self-censorship. So this loss of freedom, loss of free speech, loss of academic freedom is a huge problem. It's not just the administration's firing people or threatening them with disciplinary action. It is very much this peer-to-peer effect, and it happens among students as well. Students are afraid of students going after them on social media. It's this peer-to-peer discrimination, and it's very much slanted against those on the right, generally. A few examples of this, going outside of academia. If we compare a Biden voter working in a workplace they identify as majority Republican, 53% of them still say they would share their beliefs with their work colleagues, whereas only 29% of Trump voters working in a self-identified Democrat workplace would be willing to share their views with colleagues. This is not university, this is general public. Likewise, in Britain, 66% of Remain voters working in Leave-dominated workplaces said they would feel free to express their political beliefs, whereas only 38% of Leave voters working in Remain workplaces. It looks very similar to those results in the US, a kind of 2-to-1 asymmetry. And so we've kind of got this quite strong asymmetry in terms of political prejudice in the two societies, very much slanted against the right. Now you combine that with academia, for example, the social sciences and humanities. It's probably about 12 or 13 left to right in the US, and it's about 9-to-1 in Britain. So you've got a 9-to-1 slant, plus you've got asymmetry in terms of bias. I mean, that's going to have a massive effect in terms of people's willingness to share their political beliefs and in the general sense of freedom. So now, is it the case that the rest of society is becoming like the campus? Well, the answer is not quite. That's an exaggeration. So this is just a chart from the UK looking at a series of different occupations. We asked people where they worked. And so in a factory, 85% of Remain supporters would feel free to express their views, 64% of Leave voters. There's about a 25-point gap across the entire data set. But if you look at the university sector, it's like 54%. It's massive. So there you see the biggest discrepancy. It's not that bad in these other sectors, where it's more like 30 points instead of sort of 50 points. So the universities are worse, but the rest of society, to some degree is mirroring what's going on in the universities. It's just not as extreme. Yeah.
I just want to kind of push back on that. You said that the problem is not that bad. I mean, really these numbers should be 100% in all categories, because you should feel free to express yourself no matter where you are, no matter what you think, period. 50% average of leave there on that category, or on the start, feeling free to speak up wherever, depending on wherever they work. I still view that as a very low number.
I agree. I mean, I would like to see that number at 100 as well. And then we could look at other numbers too. So for example, you ask people if they are afraid of being fired or not being promoted at work if their political beliefs become known. There's been a number of surveys on this. In the US, it's like, amongst right-leaning voters, it's something like 35%. And in Britain, that number is about 25%. Significant numbers of people are really afraid. Now, if you take young right-leaning voters, it's even higher. So, yeah, I mean, this is a massive problem of expressive freedom, especially at work. People are really afraid that they're going to suffer consequences for speech. Yeah.
Has there been any studies or polls that look at this over time? It's like if you did the same poll 30 years ago,
Yeah, so there has been some of that in the US case. There's numbers from 1950s. From the 1950s, I'm scratching my head to remember what the question was, but the numbers in the 1950s showed massively less concern. And I think one of the Cato reports showed, but essentially, yeah, over time, there has been a sort of growing sense in which people are not feeling free to express their political beliefs. So yeah, I think that, and I don't have that stat to hand, I'd have to look it up for you, but yes, the answer to you is yes, there is evidence of it. And I think it also corresponds to other evidence. I mean, if we want to talk about a time series, the General Social Survey has been running since 1972. And what you can see in the General Social Survey is starting around 2000, they've been asking the same question about would such and such a person be allowed to speak in public? A militarist, a socialist, an atheist, and racist is one of the categories. And for a long time, there was growing toleration in all these categories. Starting around 2000, the racist ones started turning. All the other ones kept going up, the racist one turned down. That kind of indicates that that particular issue had become kind of part of public morality, become a taboo, whereas the other ones were no longer taboos. And there's also survey work showing that current generation of students, of young people, differs a lot from young people, let's say in 1990 or 1980. So we can look at 18-year-olds in 1990, 18-year-olds in 2020, and you can see quite substantial differences on some of these free speech items. So it's not an age thing, it's actually generational. There's a good paper by Jack Citron and Dennis Chong that look at this, actually. It came out last year. I can give you the details on it. They really look at this through the GSS and they say, this looks generational. It doesn't look like an age issue. And so why is this asymmetry existing? Okay, so and I think it very much comes back to this idea of public morality shifts, and particularly on the sort of left of the spectrum, morality is very much about those cultural socialists. Two key touchstones. Jonathan Haidt talks about moral foundations theory. You've got care, harm, and equality. Now, those are the two key foundations for political progressives. And because those are the key moral foundations, there's been a greater tendency, I would argue, to moralize political debate and dispute. So these are not issues that people can just disagree about because they have different policy solutions. But actually, if you are of the opposing view, you are morally suspect. If you're opposing equality and you're opposing harm protection for minority groups, even if that's emotional safety, emotional harm protection, there's something wrong with you. You must be immoral. And so if we look at this chart, which is a survey I ran in Quotas, small survey, the number of cases is in brackets. But what you can see is that amongst white liberals, we have 44%. Amongst the under 40 white liberals who are saying that people who disagree with me politically are generally immoral. So there's that link in between morality and politics. Morality is very much black and white binary. Politics, which should be about a range of views, shades of gray, dispute. But instead, we're getting this much more black and white picture of people who disagree with me politically. So I think this kind of is an illustration of part of what's going on, is that there's a greater tendency to link morality with politics amongst those on the left side of the spectrum, particularly white liberals, less so amongst black liberals. And one of the hypotheses I think that I'm interested in is the possibility that amongst black liberals, there are other kinds of sources of identity, such as race, such as perhaps religion, that are in some way checking or cross-cutting ideology, whereas for white liberals in particular, ideology is very, very central to their identity. And I have data on that too, but I'm not going to waste your time on that, but I can speak to it. Okay, yeah.
So would that also explain this startling fact that black conservatives are much more able than white conservatives to separate politics from morality? Are they more religious?
They also, the difference is that, so in the case of black conservatives, they are more likely to say religion or race is an important identity to me than moral values and ideology. white conservatives are still quite likely to say moral values and ideology are kind of top identities. Now, they're also likely to say religion and nationhood are important identities. So there's, I think, a certain degree to which they're cross-cutting identities, although sometimes those religious and national and racial identities reinforce the ideology. What is known as stacked identities in political science. I think for white conservatives, to some degree, religion and patriotism are reinforcing conservative ideology, whereas that's much less true for black voters, where there's not much correlation between whether you are kind of religious, whether you're patriotic, even ideology doesn't correlate with party identity very much. So it's just a different, there isn't that sort of stacked phenomenon where issues and ideology and partisanship are all lined up the way it is with whites. Okay. I've talked a bit about this phenomenon and how I think it operates, this challenge really between cultural liberalism and cultural socialism, that it's really about true beliefs, public morality. Public morality elevates harm protection and equality of outcome for identity groups. That's not just a woke thing, it's the morality that we're living through, and that makes it easier for outrage entrepreneurs to key into that structure and to successfully have a moral campaign or an awakening. Now, it kind of raises a whole bunch of questions about what we can do to push back. So I don't know how much time I've got left, but hopefully enough to talk this through. What can be done? Now, some people say, oh boy, we've got to get rid of liberalism because liberalism is the problem that led to wokeness, and we've got to be post-liberal. And I don't quite take that view. I actually think there are a lot of levers that we can pull within the procedural liberal system to fight back against this. At the very least, to make institutions like universities resemble public opinion much more than they do. And in order to do that, I think that we need to use the one institution really that the public can control, which is elected government. Now, there are some who would say, we've got to have a market-based approach and have set up parallel institutions. I'm kind of a both-and person. I think you've got to do both. But I think in certain sectors, like, if we take tech, something like a Google, to imagine that we're going to have a different Google anytime soon, or to imagine even with the major social media platforms or universities. I mean, there's too many network effects. There are a lot of barriers to entry. It's unlikely that we're going to see a lot of creative destruction, I would say. So what I think is that we need to have a way of allowing the sunlight from public opinion, which is generally pretty sane on a lot of these issues, into these elite institutions. The only way that's going to happen is if governments actually make it a priority to try and reform these institutions. And so that means they're going to have to regulate these institutions, draft legislation, set up new bureaucracies, issue guidance. So for example, protecting free speech, can we make it such that companies are not allowed to fire people for speech that's made in private? Can we reform equality and diversity law? The Civil Rights Act here, or in the UK, the 2010 Equality Act, issuing very specific guidance that says, no, none of the obligations under the Equality Act to, quote, foster good relations between groups, none of that is all subservient to people's right to free speech and also academic freedom. So you can specify very clearly that academic freedom takes precedence over equality duties. Yeah.
So you're saying essentially to use governmental power and set up bureaucracies in order to facilitate this. Does that also run the risk of a different political party then being elected, and then they have those same guardrails to then use to even strengthen these things that we're talking about here?
Yes, yeah, absolutely it does. However, there's two points I'd make. Is one, doing nothing is essentially allowing the cultural socialists in these institutions an open field, right? So the party, let's say the Labour Party in Britain or the Democrats here, they don't actually have to do anything. All they have to make sure is that the other side doesn't intervene. So doing nothing is essentially allowing cultural socialism to win. Now, it's certainly the case that you could get the other party in power and they could roll all this back, but then that's going to be hopefully covered in the press. covered by other political parties and politicized. And that's, yeah, I agree, but it kind of has to happen. I mean, to some degree, it's interesting to see in the US on the critical race theory issue, how, yeah, Biden revoked it, but that certainly didn't make the issue go away. And it's an electoral liability for the Democrats in races. So getting this politicized, I think, is very important, getting it into the political process and away from the closed door, non-transparent institutions. You've got to bring transparency in. And I think you can actually reform a lot of legislation. Some of this, I've been involved in some of this in Britain, where you can have very specific definitions of terms like harassment, racism, harm, that don't allow institutions to wiggle free. Now, it's an iterative game. So, for example, there is legislation in Britain that says schools cannot politically indoctrinate, but the guidance has to be issued from the government that says this is political indoctrination, whereas that is a consensus. They've kind of said anti-racism is a consensus belief. The problem there is, unless you define racism, suddenly critical race theory can be called anti-racism, so they can get away with that. So you actually have to tighten that wording up to say, no, we define racism as this, and structural explanations are a contested belief that does not fall under a consensus. I mean, that level of detail is what you need to do in order to close these loopholes and stop some of these practices. Yeah.
But when you're saying by defining the words, do you mean defining the words baked into legislation? Because I mean, even the dictionaries are changing what words mean these days.
I mean in guidance that's issued by the government to bureaucracies as to how they're to interpret the law. It's a bit like an executive order, similarly, where you would specify how they are to interpret the legislation, and in order, you really have to nail it down with examples. You can say, you as a school, you cannot support BLM because that's a contested belief. For example, you can enforce somebody not calling somebody the N-word, but you can't enforce, say, or critical race theory or supporting BLM. And you can actually specify those examples. You can take away the wiggle room that they're going to exploit any bit of wiggle room that they can because they oppose the government, of course. But I think by being very specific in your guidance, you can take a lot of that away. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious. So to me, there seems like at least potentially a tension between two approaches, right? We talk about using a centralized cultural power to define terms. Another way of understanding centralized government power would be that the role of the government is kind of like ideological antitrust, like to sort of break up, like secondary schooling would be a good example. To prevent to make it easier for people to choose an alternative to public school or to choose an alternative to the public university, right? So one way is to try to say we have these public institutions. We're going to regulate them through careful definition and through laws. Another way is to say we're going to use the power of the government to decentralize these public institutions and allow multiple different institutions to flourish with support from the government. You see what I mean? How those are two slightly
they are. Well, you can do. I think you can do both. I mean, you can have laws that allow for what you're talking about, sort of new institutions or schools to form. But I guess what I'm talking about is taking power and autonomy away from institutions. So not allowing a university to suppress the speech rights of its students and faculty. The government is stepping in and preventing the university from oppressing its students. And I guess, I mean, we could use another example where, if the federal government desegregates the University of Mississippi, right, the federal government is in some ways taking power away from the University of Mississippi in order to enforce a conception of equal rights. So this is just with regard to freedom of speech. I should say that I was involved in a report called Academic Freedom in the UK. We made a number of recommendations to come on to the UK Academic Freedom Bill, which essentially, and it's now through third reading, so it's going to become law. What it does is it establishes an office of about 10 people with an academic freedom director, and the job of the academic freedom director is to ensure that universities are both not only protecting but promoting academic freedom. So any policies which are non-compliant with the legislation have to be rewritten. They are liable to fines for persistent violation. People can appeal around the university. All of these mechanisms are just ways in which the government is protecting the freedom of students and staff against their university. So I think that's kind of what I'm talking about in terms of you actually have to remove some autonomy from these institutions if they are working in a political way, which a lot of them have been captured, they're being politicized. You have to counter that. And they're not going to reform themselves. I really don't believe they can be reformed. That's sort of what I mean. Now, the other thing is political neutrality, guys. There's the Calvin report in 1967, University of Chicago. Rich might know what this is about, but yeah, essentially saying that if universities aren't politically neutral, they're violating the academic freedom of the staff. So when I say political neutrality, individual academics can have their views, but not anything that's official, not like the president, not any part of the university that is officially representing all of the students in the university. That needs to be, I think, rolled out. We have examples of this. The BBC in Britain, which is the state broadcaster, is under strict impartiality guides now. They bend it. But the Tories are constantly trying to find ways of, and actually somewhat successfully. I mean, I actually think, compared to some other networks, especially on Brexit, the BBC, they're always worried about being accused of being biased. And so actually that does discipline their behavior to some degree. So I do think you can work on political impartiality, particularly on...
What's the sort of slant in the BBC's last stand? Let's say it's slant in the New York Times. Because it slants left.
It slants left, but it's not as bad. For example, if I compare it to the CBC, it's nowhere near as bad as the Canadian broadcaster. I mean, but so, and it's not as bad as it's. I mean, yeah. So, yeah. And then there's this constant jockeying where the government is putting pressure on them, and I actually think that's a good thing. So they're kind of being pressured to be impartial. They don't always get there, but it's that kind of monitoring, getting into the content, into the weeds of the detail, that I think is the way to control this. I don't think simply, we're going to cut this or cut that. I don't think those simple solutions are going to do much. You really got to get in there and tweak and regulate and fine tune. Yeah.
So how do you do that successfully? Yeah. We've always struck me that a big problem for this issue is that in the end you're talking about a set of bureaucrats who are going to try and keep universities viewpoint neutral. But quis custodiet, why would I trust the bureaucrats? Because I know bureaucrats also lean far to the left. And so if this academic freedom office, or whatever the equivalent for a state of Texas might be, is going to be filled with true believers from the left, I'm going to have a hard time believing that it's actually going to help us see more viewpoint diversity in academia.
Okay, so that kind of gets me to another point here, which is I have this point about what you need to have the right people in place. The people are the policy, right? If you get the wrong people into these bodies, they're going to do nothing, and we can look at, I think the University of California has an academic freedom, right, group, and they're toothless, they don't want to rock the boat, okay, so nothing's going to happen on academic freedom, but you need to get the right people in. So in this case, with the conservative government in Britain, they have a big hand in influencing who gets these roles. Let's just put it, I probably can't say more than that, but in any case, there is a degree to which you can get people who really believe in the mission to run these agencies or bodies. That's key. Without that, of course, the thing fails. Now, how do you ensure you get the right people in? I mean, this sort of, if you look at think of the Federalist Society for the Supreme Court and the way they vet candidates, right? And unfortunately, because these bodies are being politicized by the people in them, you have to play that game until people agree to an impartial, politically neutral body. I mean, the goal is to have something that is impartial and neutral. But in the meantime, while one side is politicizing these institutions in the direction of cultural socialism, the only way to deal with it, I think, is to politicize, get this salient in the political process, make it matter for the media for voting, shine some sunlight in there, get some scrutiny in there. So if you think of the Federalist Society, they're vetting candidates, they develop a network so that they can place people. And increasingly, of course, only a minority of law school graduates will be conservative, let's say. But you actually have to be quite organized, create a policy network between talented people have a network, and try and place people into these roles. And one of the biggest problems, certainly in the Conservative Party, is they can't find people who are qualified to fill these positions. Even though they can use their political influence to get their people in, they don't have enough people with the minimum talent levels, the minimum qualifications to take on these roles. So we need to nurture talent and develop it somehow, like the Federalist Society does for these issues, to get them into the right bureaucratic position. Now, the NRA, again, not a cause I'm particularly passionate about, but if you think about the NRA, they are able to sort of have scorecards for different politicians and put pressure on politicians to adopt certain stances on issues. That kind of needs to happen on cultural war issues, because one of the things we're seeing in Britain and in the US is that a lot of politicians come in to be politicians, or they're motivated by 1980s style economic liberalism. They don't care about, they don't even know about, or they certainly don't care about these issues such as free speech, such as critical race and queer theory being taught in school. So you kind of need to put pressure, raise the salience of this issue in the electorate, and therefore lead to selecting or primarying out or primarying in of people who prioritize this issue. Because you've got to get the issue up the priority level for politicians. They have to understand that they need to be strong on this issue, and there has to be delivery of policy. Finally, I would say there is a role for the average citizen in terms of just resisting the creep of new buzzwords, new policies, renaming buildings, all of these things, wherever possible, should be resisted. Obviously, not if you're going to lose your job, but to the extent possible, if people are able to resist these changes, which are really an exercise in kind of moral power. And each time there is a new move, a new buzzword, a new renaming that's increasing the normative power of cultural socialism. So there is a role culturally. And then finally we get to new institutions like UATX. I mean, very important to have institutions that model where we want to go as a society, so that eventually, through reform, hopefully these public institutions can approximate the sort of freedom that you might see at an institution like UATX or in perhaps the Salem Center. You have to have these new experiments, but I'm a sort of both-and person. I think you've got to do the private stuff, but you also have to do the government stuff, if only because, you know, who knows, this culture, it may not change for 50 years. It's certainly going in the wrong direction if we look generationally. Do we want to sacrifice 2 generations of political dissenters to effectively self-censorship? I think it's just irresponsible. We've got to try as much as possible to allow the views of the public into these institutions, to try and at least get them close to where the public is on these issues. And with that, I will finish up.
I guess I would say that this kind of like generational trend and these kind of revivals are occurring due to some kind of like spiritual crisis in society, some kind of like lack of purpose and meaning in society, because this is really kind of like a transcendent, you know, alternative of justice. And you see it also with like Black metal movements that happen, especially in Europe and also in the left, with the decline of religion and the church going. This kind of like ascendancy of this alternative religion. Is there any evidence? I mean, that's just my sense, but is there actual evidence for that? Do you think that there's something there? And if so, I mean, that's like a lot less practical than your solutions, but is there also a solution there, like a religious solution, like kind of an alternative, like a religious revival, organized religion, and more church going around?
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, because you're right. The timing of this, you know, in the U.S. case at least, it times with religious decline. I mean, I think that's less. It's less easy to make that case in Britain, where religion's been kind of at a very low ebb for a much longer period of time. I do think there is a connection in the sense that this is a political religion. It does fill a spiritual need, so it's ministering to the same needs. The only thing is that if you look at the data again, so if we take something like white guilt, the big predictors of white guilt are where you are on the left-right spectrum and your age. Younger you are, the more white guilt you have, amongst white people, obviously. Whereas how religious you are doesn't seem to correlate very much. And I think it depends, obviously, what kind of religion, because a lot of religious institutions are also quite woke. Like in Britain, the Church of England or the Episcopal Church here, it seems as though they're able to combine a certain version of religion and this sort of public morality pretty easily. So if it's a kind of, if it was a revival of that kind of religion, I don't think it would materially affect it in any way. But perhaps there's a certain kind of religion that maybe it would have an impact. Very hard to know. I mean, I kind of tend to have this view that these ideologies have their own evolution. New innovators, they have to keep it fresh, so they got to, we got to talk about something new. We'll talk about trans, so they have to keep breaking into new ground to keep everybody interested. And I think part of what's occurred is just this evolution of the left-wing ideology towards the identity categories, and then eventually towards more stridency in certain ways. So I just don't know. I mean, I do think that, yes, if you had a very strict type of religion and you had that revive in a big way, yeah, almost certainly that would have an effect. But of course, that's not on the horizon, let's just say. Although actually, I think it might be on the horizon over a 50 or 100-year period, but not necessarily imminently. Yeah. Who wants to go first?
I've got a much less high-minded question about kind of granular policy, which is a lot of this bias that you'll know being academic takes place with ostensibly with subjective assessments that are made of who gets funding for a PhD, who gets hired, out of it, like who gets shortlisted. These are decisions that are often made in a small room with people, conversations that are not recorded, and maybe things are not even being spoken of explicitly. So if we're going to try to regulate that, how like, I guess I would say in a very practical way, how could you try to make sure that, for example, AHRC PhD funding is not allocated just on the basis of political activism or hiring? So like, what's gonna actually regulate that?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have time to cover one of the points that I was talking about, which was that I'm kind of in favor of this idea that I'm calling equivalent action, which is that if you want to do diversity, equity, and inclusion on race and gender, I think you should be obligated to do exactly the same on politics and ideology. So if for example, now if you don't want to do any EDI, then you don't have to do any EDI on politics, but I don't think you should be allowed to do one and not the other. So if an institution wants to have a representative faculty of the greater population, if that's its aim, then they've got to do the same for politics, right? Now, I just think it would be very interesting because the choice would be given to the universities as to what do you want to do. Do you want to have colorblind hiring? You can do that. But if you want to try and engineer your faculty to look like the population, then you should also be doing the same thing on politics. And that could be monitored. I actually think you could monitor that. Yeah, I think governments, you can look at performance. You can look at, oh, you're not performing well on political diversity. You've got to work on that and stop, you've got to bring that up to the level of your race, gender. So that would be an example of where I think you would, now, they may decide to scrap the whole thing, but that's got benefits too, so. Yeah.
You talk about the media a bit. I mean, I was really struck by your charts with, 2010, boom, these microscopes taking off. And so, I mean, my impression, certainly over the course of my life, has been a kind of sea change, right? Local papers go out of business, so they're all consolidated, Well, so what's going on in 2010? I mean, you've got, people going into the media. So first you have electronic media, and then so much of our lives are mediated by electronic stuff. Then you have a sort of, it seems to be anyway, like a sort of elite takeover of these new media, and consolidation. I mean, this is a huge problem because we can do all this stuff, but once the media is standing between us and people get the word out to quote and so forth. Whereas really, it's like we've got, big iron balls chased in our feet or something, and we're trying to move. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts about what's going on with what happened.
Well, yeah, there's kind of two things, I guess. One is social media take off, and the other is the new. You're right. So all the classified ads are falling away, and the new type of journalism is more about clicks. I think Ezra Klein talks about this in his book. So, once clicks are what make you money, then that does generate more of an outrage model and so I think that is one explanation, is that it is simply a kind of outrage model of journalism. And that, I don't know whether it was that or the social media. I still have somewhat of a belief that it was also partly the degree to which this ideology was simply achieving a critical mass in institutions, eventually moving outside of academia to include corporate HR departments, for example, the law, medicine. And so you've got a spreading out of these people who've been steeped in, for example, critical legal, critical race theory, etc., graduating. Graduates of these studies programs now are trying to find jobs, HR departments. I think there's partly a story around tipping points, but there's probably also a story around social media and clickbait journalism. So I can't really prize those apart, but I think some cocktail of those is probably what did it.
So a question on you use the term that somehow the left was waiting for a moment like that, for that guilt to be available and weaponize that in order to mass power, right? That's the story there. But this, of course, has an implication across the Western world. From Brazil, it's the same thing in Brazil, exactly the same thing in Brazil, exactly the same thing in Chile. It's a very similar cultural moment, I think, in a sense. All of a sudden, there's like the same issues that we make across the place. However, we have a very nice control group, which is the non-Western world, right? The Western world is about what, third of humanity, maybe less.
Define the Western world.
Well, Europe and Americas, that's the Western world.
So not Latin America.
No, in Americas.
Oh, in America.
Well, that's the Western world. Outside of that, it's not the Western world. Africa is not really the Western world, nor is Asia, right? And there's much less diversity in those continents. One continent is primarily black, the other continent, like there's two groups of people, but vast majority, right? So they cannot go into that direction. They don't have the ability necessarily.
Well, they have ethnic
India, there's all sorts of set aside.
I understand. That's why I was going to go with my question to Japan.
Yeah.
Because let's go to Japan, where it's a homogeneous country. It's a very homogeneous racial country, right? Where there is a left, I guess.
Yeah, there is. There definitely is.
So what is that? What has the playbook of the left in Japan been in the world in which the left in the rest of the world has, decided that to go into it? Is the left in Japan about authoritarian still?
It's much more, I think, about union power and
So it is.
It is. It's more economic. But you don't actually have to go there. You can go to Eastern Europe as an interesting control, I would say, because you don't see this happening in Eastern Europe anywhere near like in the West. And I was looking at, those trends about those awakenings, the use of the term racist and sexist, having that big jump and jump and jump. That didn't happen in the East European languages. So they didn't have this because they were behind the Iron Curtain. I think just a different education. They are more on guard against utopianism because of their expertise, the experience. Yeah. So it's just a different historical trajectory, and that leads to more skepticism. I'd be interested in Latin America. I mean, like a place that's had the left, like Colombia, maybe. I'm trying to think of a place where they might be a bit more allergic to these kind of movements.
You see, the dogmas are falling. Very slowly in Latin America, but they are falling. Colombia fall left, Bolivia became a very ethno left, they came into power. Brazil had a Trump moment of Bolsonaro, but the rhetoric in the media encourages this Europe image here. Chile has taking a big step back, using the similar playbook of trying to get indigenous rights into the Constitution.
At least they didn't vote for it.
They didn't vote for it. They put 7% of people voted to at least work on it, which was a great problem. Right? So,
but they may not have. Those voters may not have realized right away what what was
And
going
that's the
on.
sunlight, and shedding some light on it, I think is very important.
Yes.
Exactly what you're saying. The moment that they put it in front of you, like, whoa, 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 this is crazy.
Right. Yeah. And so I'd be interested in the universities, in what it's like in the universities in Chile. Like, I think the Bolivia stuff is different because that's more like indigenous national. I mean, it's kind of.
How about putting the tender cases up to vote by the citizens? I love that.
Yeah, well, wow, that's that. Yeah, it depends which citizens, right?
No, it's just that that's gonna be great. I think the state of Texas will work just fine.
Right, yeah.
Here, fine, you're in.
As long as I think as long as you don't have a self-selecting group of kind of busybodies, which, I mean, because part of the, people who are on the progressive left they just participate in politics at a much higher rate, particularly that very activist kind of 8%. They're hugely overrepresented in social media posting, like 5 times more than the average person. So any kind of body that is sort of in some way a citizens, civil service, or not civil society kind of group is going to distort things. So you have to be very careful who you're allowing to do the selection.
No, we're in the ballot. I was guessing about a long ballot here.
Yeah.
I just want to get your impression on something else. It's, I've been shocked at how effective cultural socialists have been in taking over capitalist institutions like corporations, through the young movements like that on the environment. It's clear that their capitalist organizations are implementing policies that cannot be passed through democratic institutions.
Right.
So I'm just interested in your view on that and why that's been so effective, whether politics can be relied on.
Yeah, really good question. I mean, I think what's happening with capitalism is, there's certain areas of penetration, like the HR department, the communications department, where they're getting graduates, let's say from Ivy League departments, but from the humanities and social science, into those particular jobs. Now, what I would say about the corporations is it's not as new necessarily as we think. So if you look back at the history of affirmative action, not creating a hostile environment, this is in the 70s and the 80s, already the racial sensitivity training, the affirmative action, all of these things were there in corporate America. So that was part of what Steele was talking about, this virtue signaling. Hey, we have moral legitimacy as a firm. And even when Reagan rolled back the requirements, they still kept going with their diversity and sensitivity training. So I don't think it's as new as some people think it is. It's just got to a scale. A lot of these things are about scale, and they're just more extreme. And you have also the phenomenon of the activist employee, which is new. So this is just, again, more of these young millennials. I didn't go into this as much, but basically your under 30s are about twice as cultural socialist on a lot of issues. An example would be James Damore. If you take the James Damore case and you poll on that, you find that people who are 18 to 25, 2/3 in Britain and the U.S. think that was a good idea to fire him, compared to sort of between 1/4 and 1/3 of those over 50. So you've got a big age problem in the younger people who are now entering into these companies, especially graduates of the elite universities, but not only them, bringing these beliefs into that setting, thinking that, I want to work for a virtuous company, and therefore it's intolerable if I'm working for a company that doesn't share my values and want to bring my whole self to work, all that stuff. So yeah, that's somewhat new, but that's going to just add to what has already been there, which is a certain compliance on affirmative action and a hostile environment and these sorts of issues that have been going for a while. Now, how do you attack it? How do you deal with it? I do think there probably are going to be legislative solutions and bureaucratics.
In regulatory, this sort of your frame here for universities and these institutions is the frame that at least it's starting to, I don't know how successful it will be, but it seems to have a consensus across red states in America to try to go legislate and say, listen, no, you need to be politically neutral. Your job is capitalism, not all this other stuff, right? So that the regulations coming in, how effective, I don't know.
Yeah.
But now, like the SEC is starting to help complement.
That's right. So, but at least in America, we have the variety, right? You can start different regulatory frameworks in different places, might create.
But you can't get away from the SEC.
No, No, but there's ways in which they can manage things very clearly. People operate in Texas, you know, there's certain things you have to abide by, and so on. So,
And the SEC, of course, is public, right? I mean, it's so therefore, political impartiality can be imposed upon it, and you could define what they're doing as political. So instead of saying that's ethical, you can say, well, that's not a consensus, that's actually political, and you're violating the impartiality guidance. Like in the UK, there's impartiality in the civil service, the BBC, teachers, well, that's in the law, it's about enforcing it. I don't know whether you could draft a law like that for the SEC. Now, you probably, for private companies, it's tough. I think private companies is going to be harder, but maybe they have to be forced to declare that to any customers before they get, you know.
So you know, the legislation has been in place and has already, there's some teeth to it. In the state of Texas, a few banks, including Credit Suisse, is not allowed to do business with any money that's state of Texas money, period, because it's discriminating against oil and gas. So that's like, you know, oh, state of Texas is the 10th largest economy in the world, and the government sector is pretty big, right? And the Credit Suisse can no longer do operation with that slice of the public money of the state of Texas because of their political choices. So, you know, that's legislation got passed 2 years ago and has hurt some old capitalists out there already. So again, more of that is
and you could also do some regulation too. I mean, I think we didn't talk as much about the social media companies, but for example, making their algorithms in some way public or open to inspection, so that to ensure that they are not again acting in a politically prejudicial way. Because I mean, I do think trying to get political belief as a protected characteristic, you know, that is, I think, a strategy. I mean, yes, we could say, yeah, we'd love it if there were no protected characteristics. I think it's not that practical to go that route. I think it's better to multiply these characteristics. So in Britain now, there was a case, someone was fired for essentially being a gender critical feminist, saying that, you know, a woman is an adult human female and trans women aren't women. And that's so, and there was a court case, a very important court case, which essentially said you cannot, if you fire somebody for a sincerely held political belief, that's no longer acceptable. So now companies are not going to be able to fire somebody who expresses that opinion. So the next question would be then to take other cases so that other kinds of speech are deemed philosophical belief, not as something you would be fired for, right? So I think getting those kinds of protections for philosophical belief, I think would help to at least protect employees in a number of different areas.
But you feel the whole point is to kind of reinvent classical liberal notions into the world, part of which is freedom and limited government. Are you guys comfortable using government to beat up cultural socialism?
I think I think that actually people who are kind of fundamentalist on the limited government stuff, what you're doing is you're essentially clearing the field for a kind of more or less a woke takeover. I mean, you have to engage the battle because they are political actors. They're just political actors within institutions. And if you take this kind of very kind of hands-off libertarian approach, you're just more or less clearing the field, I think, you know. So I definitely think you need to get involved in government regulation of these movements.
I'm curious to ask you a question. It's a slightly different tack, which is the way that the trends that you've mapped out map onto a different set of trends, which is trends of things like interracial marriage and racial representation at the top level. Like there's a sense in which if those trends continue, the problems that all of this is purportedly addressing will kind of go away. You see what I mean? So my question would be, what is the relative progress there? Like what I'm getting at is there's a sense in which the national, to draw a comparison. Early in your talk, you mentioned how once upon a time in America it was a big deal if you were like Italian or Irish. Nowadays, really nobody cares because everybody's so intermarried. You know, it's like, right. You know what I mean? It's just not what it's not what it was in like 1890, right? So is the trend, and it seems like there's something similar happening with Hispanic or Black or these other categories that at one time seemed very fixed. Is that just moving too slowly to sort of undercut this, or like how do those two changes map to each other?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost something that speaks to my last book, actually. But yeah, so the first thing I'd say is, okay, really we're talking about next century for a large scale mix, right? So if you take the US and Britain, you know, the mixed race grouping a majority that's like the 2100s. And of course, leaving aside all this, whether Hispanic and white is actually a racial mix or not. But, you know, so we're going to be living in the current racial categories for quite some time, our lifetimes. Now, of course, there is a growing, you know, mixed group, but even if you take mixed, they will tend to identify to some degree one way or the other. And it just depends. So white Asian and white Hispanic will to some degree slightly lean white, white black will lean black. There's quite a good book by Richard Alba on this. His last book, The Great Demographic Illusion, talks a lot about these. So yeah, eventually you're right. But I mean, how far down the road? We're probably talking over a century from now. But yeah, in terms of
you're talking about equal outcomes to groups. Maybe you achieve that at race or something. But on gender, that's going to be a tough one.
Yeah.
So that's somehow going to be always there, right?
And on race, of course, it depends, right? I mean, it'll be maybe certain groups of Latinos, it'll be certain Asian groups, maybe certain black groups, but maybe not other black groups. And so, you know, it's not obvious that you're just going to get this automatic representation. It'll still be skewed in different ways depending on the industry. Maybe tech will be heavily Asian. I don't know. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking through. There's still going to be a different mix and different. Veterinarians will probably be, you know, that field is going to have more women, or nursing will be, you know, be more female. You know, it's one of those interesting questions. What is the natural gender and race split that should emerge if there were no biases of any kind? You know, it's a very hard question to answer.
Is Norway a good example of that?
I just don't know. I mean,
Norway is a very equal rights system for gender, and they don't have diversity. So,
well, no, they do have diversity in Norway. Oh, they do. Yeah,
it's small. No, it's small.
It's not that small. It's not that small. I think it's like 12. I'm thinking the non-ethnically Norwegian is like 12 to 15%.
Danish or something, right?
No. You've seen the last Swedish elections, Carlos.
Yeah, no. Norway is not. You know, it's, you know, Oslo would have a reasonable amount of multicultural. It's mainly Muslim groups. Yeah, I mean, it's not. I'm trying to think maybe Iceland.
The gender part, I think that's the thing that you read a lot on some analysis. That Norway ended up getting actually a lot of disparity between male and female activities. Even though they are most equal in a lot of ways between male and female, the outcome they're very unequal there.
Yeah, the gender one is I think you're right. I mean, there's so many different things that are more deeply rooted. You know, evolutionary psychology stuff. You know, the race one is probably more likely to reach some kind of representation. Not my area, but.
Well, it's been long enough. That was fun.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.